In the endless stretch of the Milky Way, countless civilizations had risen and fallen over millions of years. Some were made of flesh and blood, others of light and crystal, but all shared one common dream: to explore, to connect, and to survive. Out of that dream came the Celestial Concord, an alliance of 27 advanced species who promised peace and progress for all. For hundreds of years, their worlds traded knowledge, built cities that touched the stars, and explored the unknown together. Each species brought its own strengths. The engineers of Talrith who could shape metal with their minds, the thinkers of Doran who could compute the patterns of time, and the humans of Earth who were known for their creativity and stubborn hope. Then, one quiet rotation of the galaxy changed everything. It began at the edge of known space, an empty, silent sector where signals often vanished. A mining outpost there detected strange energy readings like waves breaking against nothingness. The next day, the outpost was gone. No distress call, no debris, only silence. The Concord sent scouts. None returned. What came instead was a storm, an armada of something beyond reason. They didn't come in ships. They came as swarms, living machines, vast and endless, eating through metal and energy like predators tearing through prey. Their origin was unknown. Their motives were impossible to understand. They didn't speak, they didn't stop, and they didn't spare anyone. The first worlds that fell were those closest to the rim. The people there never had a chance. Entire cities disappeared in hours. Fleets tried to stand their ground, but their weapons barely scratched the enemy. The survivors fled inward, carrying horror stories that shook even the most fearless commanders. Panic began to spread among the allied species. The council chambers that were once filled with laughter and calm debates now echoed with fear. Every meeting ended with the same question: should they stay and fight or retreat to save what they could? The larger empires, the ones with vast fleets, decided that survival was more logical than resistance. "You cannot fight a storm," one counselor said. "You can only move away from its path." One by one, the voices of retreat filled the council. They planned to abandon the outer colonies, even entire star systems, to buy time for the core worlds. But among all the chaos and despair, there was one species that didn't move: humans. They sat quietly at the edge of the council, listening. When their turn came to speak, the human representative didn't bring a chart or statistics. They just said, "If we run from this, there will be no place left to run to. We fight, or we all vanish." The other delegates called it madness. Humans had smaller fleets, older weapons, and far fewer colonies than most others. Some species pitied them, calling their decision noble but foolish. Others mocked them. "Your bravery will feed the swarm," one alien leader said before leaving the chamber for good. But humans didn't argue. They didn't threaten or plead. They simply went home and started preparing. Back on Earth, factories that had been quiet for decades came alive. The sky filled with the thunder of engines, the smell of fuel, and the glow of plasma forges. On the Moon and Mars, thousands of volunteers joined the defense forces. They knew the odds. They knew what was coming. But they also knew something no other species seemed to understand. Sometimes, standing your ground means more than winning. The message went out across every frequency, carried by human voices, and we will not run. This is our home. If the galaxy must fall, it won't fall without a fight. Other colonies heard it too. Some aliens who had fled their worlds began drifting toward human space, seeking shelter. They expected to find chaos, but instead found something strange: unity. Humans were not just defending their own kind. They were building bunkers for everyone. Engineers, scientists, soldiers, even farmers, everyone had a role. Every small colony became a fortress. Every ship was refitted, every hand ready to help. A refugee transport carrying hundreds of alien families once landed on a human colony called Arcadia Prime. They expected to be turned away, but human workers helped them off the ship, shared food, and even gave up their own shelters. The refugees asked, "Why help us?" "We are not your kind." One of the workers smiled and said, "Because running alone is death, standing together is life." That spirit began to spread. Reports of human bravery started reaching the farthest corners of the galaxy. On the run, many alien captains tuned into human broadcasts, hearing voices that were calm, confident, and full of heart. The tone wasn't one of despair, but determination. Yet deep inside, humanity knew the coming war would test every ounce of their strength. The first human defense line was built near the frontier system of Vega 9. an old mining outpost that had seen better days. Engineers turned it into a fortress, ringed with railguns and defense drones. Families from nearby colonies were evacuated underground. The soldiers on the surface painted old Earth symbols on their ships and armor, reminders of home, of why they stood there. When the enemy finally appeared, it wasn't like any fleet seen before. The stars vanished behind them as if space itself was being swallowed. Sensors couldn't count their numbers. The machines moved like a tide, each one different, shifting and adapting, absorbing light and metal from everything they touched. The first clash was brutal. Human ships fought until their ammunition ran out. Pilots flew even when their crafts were breaking apart. When one station lost power, another relayed energy across broken lines to keep the defense grid alive. Humanity's command center received thousands of last messages, crew members sending farewells, engineers activating final weapons, soldiers saying they'd hold the line for just one more minute. The Vega 9 line didn't survive, but their sacrifice slowed the enemy. It gave time for other human worlds to prepare. To the rest of the galaxy, this seemed small, almost meaningless, but to those who watched closely, it meant everything. For the first time since the invasion began, the enemy had been delayed. Days later, the transmission logs from the Vega outpost were found. The last message came from a young officer, his voice tired but steady. "If anyone hears this, tell them we didn't run. Tell them humanity stood." The message went viral. Across space, refugees, soldiers, and leaders who had once fled began to listen. Some wept, some felt shame, and others felt something new. A spark of courage. And back on Earth, people stood together watching the distant skies. The world governments didn't argue over borders anymore. Old rivalries faded. Every nation, every person understood what was at stake. They were not fighting for land or power. They were fighting for existence itself. The days that followed were filled with long nights, constant work, and an unspoken unity that wrapped around humanity like armor. There was fear, yes, but also pride. Even the children who watched from safe shelters drew pictures of starships and soldiers, calling them heroes. In the farthest parts of the galaxy, alien historians would later write that humanity's decision to stay and fight marked the true beginning of the Great Defense. Because when the most advanced and powerful races fled into the dark, it was a species from a small blue world, barely a few thousand years into spaceflight, that stood their ground. They didn't do it for glory or conquest. They did it because they believed someone had to. And as the swarm continued its march, humanity became the line the galaxy had never expected, the line that refused to break, the spark that refused to die. In that moment, even as the stars dimmed with fire and ash, one truth became clear. While others chose to survive, humans chose to stand. When the outer defense lines fell, the galaxy thought humanity would finally give up. Most believed they would abandon their colonies like everyone else had. But something different happened. The fall of Vega 9 didn't break human spirit. It lit a fire inside it. Across human space, the loss didn't create panic. It created unity. People gathered in city squares and underground shelters, watching transmissions from the front lines. They saw faces covered in sweat and dust, ships burning across the stars, and messages that said, "We're still here. We'll keep fighting." Factories worked without rest. Spaceports once meant for trade now launched warships every hour. Even small towns on distant moons became part of the effort. Children drew pictures of the soldiers defending the skies, and families hung them on walls as signs of hope. Everyone wanted to do something, anything to help. On one distant colony, a group of farmers gave up their tractors so engineers could melt them down and use the metal for armor plating. In another place, scientists turned their research labs into makeshift repair stations for damaged ships. There was no waiting for orders anymore. Humanity didn't need instructions to survive. They just acted together. As the fleet prepared for new battles, the human command decided to send a message across the galaxy. The same words echoed through every frequency, every language, and every world that could still receive a signal. To those who can hear us, don't run. Stand with us. We will hold the line. At first, very few responded. Most of the other races were still in hiding, scattered deep inside the safe zones near the galactic core. They watched in silence as humans fought, certain that the war was already lost. But their silence didn't matter to humanity. The people of Earth and its colonies had already made their choice. They began fortifying worlds on the edge of human territory, places like Arcadia Prime, Orion Station, and Epsilon Ridge. These were not rich planets. Most were half-developed colonies or old mining bases. But they became strongholds. On Arcadia Prime, humans built massive defense towers that reached into the clouds. Thousands of workers lived in temporary camps, sleeping only a few hours a night. The air smelled of metal and heat, but nobody complained. They knew the enemy would come soon, and they wanted to be ready. Refugees from other races started arriving in larger numbers. Some came in small ships with damaged engines, others in giant transport carriers. They expected rejection, but instead they were welcomed. Humans shared food, medicine, and even homes with them. At first, the refugees didn't understand. "Why are you helping us?" one alien asked a human mechanic. "Your people are fighting for your own survival." The mechanic smiled while tightening a bolt on a ship's hull and said, "Because we're all in this together. If the galaxy falls, what good is surviving alone?" That simple kindness changed hearts. Slowly, the fear among the refugees turned into gratitude and then respect. They started volunteering, repairing ships, building shelters, or helping in hospitals. Many of them admitted that they had once believed humans were reckless and unpredictable, too emotional for serious leadership. But now they saw something else. Humanity's emotions were not weaknesses. They were strength. Soon, news began to spread. A few brave alien captains who had once fled the battlefield turned their ships around. They came quietly, landing on human-controlled worlds, offering whatever little they could, supplies, information, or weapons. One of them said, "We couldn't believe you would stand against them. But you did. Now we can't hide while you bleed for all of us." Humanity's message was working. Across the stars, stories of human courage began to circulate. Videos of soldiers fighting to the last breath, engineers holding stations together under fire, and doctors working through the night to save both human and alien lives became symbols of hope. Meanwhile, the swarm, the mysterious enemy, kept advancing. They were unlike any known life form. They didn't move like armies. They flowed like a flood, spreading and consuming. Every planet they touched turned dark. Yet when they reached human space again, they met something they hadn't faced before: resistance that didn't crumble. The battle for Arcadia Prime began on a cold morning, when the sky turned red from enemy fire. The first wave of ships came in silently without warning. Sirens blared and soldiers rushed to their positions. The humans had been expecting it for weeks. Every man and woman on the planet knew what was at stake. From orbit, the human fleet formed a wall between the planet and the darkness. Ships moved in perfect coordination, weaving between explosions, firing in synchronized bursts. The enemy hit hard, burning through defense lines like fire through paper. But the humans didn't break. The command officers on Arcadia Prime sent one final broadcast before communications were jammed. "Hold your ground. No retreat." Down on the surface, civilians were being evacuated into bunkers. Alien refugees who had once been too afraid to fight were now helping guide people to safety. Some even picked up weapons, standing beside human soldiers at the barricades. One alien medic, who had escaped from another fallen world, stayed behind in the open to treat the wounded. When someone told him to run, he shook his head and said, "Humans didn't run when my world burned. I won't run now." That spirit began to spread like wildfire. Across the defense lines, people fought side by side, not because they believed they could win easily, but because they refused to surrender. The battle raged for days. The skies of Arcadia turned into rivers of fire. Ships exploded above the clouds, leaving trails of light that looked almost beautiful against the darkness. Every explosion, every scream, every message of hope carried one truth: the humans were still fighting. By the fifth day, the planet's main shield generators were failing. The command center sent word to prepare for a full evacuation, but the soldiers refused to leave. They rerouted all remaining power into the last standing shields, giving the evacuation ships a chance to escape. When the evacuation was finally complete, only a few human ships remained in orbit. The rest were gone, destroyed, or out of contact. But those that stayed kept fighting, even when they knew they couldn't survive. One pilot sent a final voice transmission before his ship disappeared from radar. "If they want this planet, they'll have to take it from our ashes." Hours later, Arcadia Prime fell silent. No one heard from the soldiers again. But days after the battle ended, a strange thing happened. The swarm didn't advance immediately. They stopped. For the first time in the entire war, they paused their movement. No one knew why. Some said it was confusion. Others believed the enemy was adapting, analyzing human tactics. But among the people of the galaxy, a different belief spread. They said the swarm had met something it didn't understand, a will too strong to crush. News of the battle reached the farthest systems. The recordings of the human transmissions were replayed millions of times. Refugees who had lost everything began whispering one sentence. They stood. Even in hiding, alien leaders started to reconsider their choices. They realized humanity wasn't just defending itself. It was defending everyone. Back on Earth, when the reports arrived, there were no celebrations. The losses were heavy, but there was pride, deep, powerful pride that filled every city and home. People didn't talk about defeat. They talked about endurance. The leaders of Earth gathered to address their people. There were no fancy words, no promises of easy victory. The message was simple. They fought for all of us. Now we must do the same. Every factory increased production. Every shipyard worked day and night. Scientists began studying captured fragments of enemy machines, hoping to find a weakness. And in the hearts of ordinary people, a single idea grew stronger with each passing day. Humanity doesn't run. While the swarm continued to move toward the next line of defense, something had already changed. Humanity's courage was no longer just their own. It had become the spark that was spreading through the galaxy. In the months that followed, more alien ships began to return from hiding. Not many at first, but enough to make a difference. They brought supplies, fighters, and even volunteers who said they wanted to fight alongside the humans. And for the first time in the war, the galaxy wasn't silent anymore. The darkness was still coming, but now it was met with voices that said, "We stand together." For humanity, that was enough reason to keep going. They had lost battles, lost worlds, and lost millions of lives. But they had gained something even greater, the faith of others. And in that fragile hope buried under smoke and starlight, the humans found their strength again. Because even as every other species had once fled, humanity still stood, holding the line for everyone else. The battle for Arcadia Prime was supposed to be quick. At least that's what the enemy thought. Every world they had invaded before had fallen within hours. Civilizations that had existed for thousands of years were erased in a single day. But when the swarm reached human space, they met something new, resistance that refused to break. From orbit, Arcadia Prime looked peaceful. The planet had green forests, wide oceans, and a growing city that humans and aliens shared. But beneath that calm surface, the world had become a fortress. Towers of metal stretched into the sky. Energy shields glowed faintly across cities and deep underground. Families huddled in shelters, listening to the thunder of war above. The first wave of the enemy came without warning. Thousands of black shapes emerged from the void, blocking out the stars. They moved like a living storm, silent but filled with deadly intent. The human fleet was already waiting. Dozens of cruisers and battleships formed a shield between Arcadia and the swarm. They didn't have the strongest weapons, but they had courage, and that made all the difference. When the first enemy shot struck, entire ships shook, alarms echoed, and hulls cracked, but nobody ran. Every pilot, every gunner, every engineer stayed at their post. The battle began with fire. Lasers cut through the darkness. Missiles streaked across space, leaving trails of light behind them. The swarm answered with energy blasts that ripped through entire ships, scattering debris like rain. But even as ships exploded, more human vessels moved in to fill the gaps. They fought not just for victory, but for time. For the people hiding below. Down on the surface, soldiers manned defense lines along the coasts and mountains. Anti-orbital cannons fired from hidden bunkers, sending beams of light into the sky. Each shot lit up the clouds, shaking the ground like thunder. Civilians, watching from underground screens, could see the sky flicker between blue and red, between hope and destruction. Inside the command center, human officers spoke in calm voices despite the chaos. Every second mattered. Every movement of the enemy had to be tracked and countered. The planet's defense grid was holding, but only barely. For every enemy ship destroyed, 5 more took its place. By the third day, the fleet in orbit had lost half its strength. Whole sections of the city were burning. Yet the people didn't give up. They worked together in silence, carrying the wounded, putting out fires and rebuilding barricades even while explosions echoed nearby. Nobody waited for orders anymore. They just acted. There were small moments of humanity even in the middle of all that horror. A young technician shared her last bottle of water with an alien refugee who had lost everything. A pilot who had ejected from a destroyed fighter was found by local farmers, who dragged him to safety with their bare hands. In a shelter, a group of children started drawing pictures of ships and stars, saying, "When this is over, we'll go home." Their voices reminded everyone why they were fighting. The fourth day brought the worst wave. The swarm adapted. They began sending down ground units, machines that tore through defenses like they were paper. But humanity had prepared for that too. Across the continents, traps were triggered, mines exploded beneath enemy walkers, and tanks rolled through burning streets. It wasn't about who had better weapons anymore. It was about who refused to fall first. Up in orbit, one of the human ships, old and heavily damaged, rammed itself directly into the enemy's main carrier. The explosion was so bright it lit up the night sky on the surface. People watching from the shelters cheered, not because the battle was won, but because that one ship had shown what humans were capable of: sacrifice. By the fifth day, communications began to fail. Entire regions lost contact with the command center. The defense towers ran low on power. Still, the people fought. They used whatever they had left: old artillery, scrap metal, even hand-built explosives. Every shot, every spark of resistance slowed the enemy a little more. The swarm finally reached the main city. Streets that once held markets and laughter were now filled with smoke and fire. Human and alien defenders fought side by side, shoulder to shoulder. There were no species now, no borders, only survivors. They fought for each other. When the main shield generator finally went down, the command center sent one last message across all frequencies. The voice was steady, even as explosions roared in the background. "We're not leaving. Arcadia stands." The message traveled far. Ships scattered across the galaxy picked it up. Some alien refugees hiding in deep space listened in silence, ashamed of their earlier retreat. One captain, after hearing those words, turned his ship around and began flying toward human space. He said to his crew, "If they're willing to die for us, we have no right to hide." Meanwhile, on Arcadia, the defenders kept fighting long after the city was lost. Small groups held positions in tunnels and ruins. They didn't have communication anymore, but they could see the glow in the sky and knew the battle was still going. In one underground passage, a group of human engineers managed to reroute power from the city's grid to reactivate a few anti-air guns. They fired blindly into the clouds, hitting whatever they could. Their efforts slowed the enemy's advance by just a few minutes, but those few minutes allowed more evacuation ships to escape the planet's surface. Hours later, the final evacuation transport took off. People watched it climb through the smoke, glowing bright against the dark sky. Everyone cheered for a moment, then picked up their weapons again. They knew most of them wouldn't live to see that ship reach safety, but that didn't matter. When the last human defenses finally fell, the world went quiet. Arcadia Prime was gone. The swarm moved on, leaving only ruins behind. But even in defeat, something powerful had been born: a legend. A week later, a passing reconnaissance ship found fragments of recordings from the battle. In one, a voice could be heard saying softly, "We fought for everyone. Remember that." That message spread across the galaxy like a flame. Refugees who had once believed the war was hopeless began whispering about humanity, the ones who didn't run. Stories grew around campfires and inside dark shelters. Some said the humans had found a way to destroy the swarm's ships from the inside. Others said their spirits haunted the battlefield, warning the enemy never to return. None of it was true, but the truth didn't matter. What mattered was what the story did. It gave people hope again. Soon, ships from other species started appearing near human space. Not fleets, just a few brave vessels. They didn't come for orders or rewards. They came to help. They brought supplies, food, and medical equipment. One alien commander simply said, "You gave us back our courage." On Earth, when the first message from Arcadia's survivors arrived, the planet fell silent. People gathered in public squares listening to the recordings. The air was heavy with both grief and pride. The leaders of Earth didn't hide the losses. They spoke honestly, saying, "Arcadia fell, but humanity did not. The enemy may have won a battle, but we've shown them something they can never understand: the strength of those who stand together." Factories kept running. New fleets were being built. Soldiers trained harder than ever. Scientists studied fragments of the swarm left behind, hoping to find patterns in their attacks. Every person, from the smallest child to the oldest worker, knew the fight was not over. But something had changed. Humanity was no longer fighting alone. The courage shown at Arcadia Prime had reached hearts across the stars. Small groups of alien volunteers joined human forces. Together, they started forming a new defense network, stronger than before. As weeks passed, wreckage from the battle continued to drift in space. Broken ships, shattered metal, and silent machines. Among that wreckage, one beacon still blinked faintly. It carried a short looping message recorded before the final explosion. It said, "For every world that falls, we'll build another. For every soldier lost, 10 more will rise. Humanity stands." That message became the anthem of the resistance. It played on every colony, every outpost, every refugee ship. It reminded everyone that the war wasn't about who had more power. It was about who had the heart to keep going. Even the enemy, for all its endless hunger, had now met something it couldn't consume: human resolve. As the stars turned slowly in the cold dark, the story of Arcadia Prime spread further than any ship could travel. And in that story, the galaxy found something it had almost forgotten: hope. Because in a universe where every other species had chosen to flee, one small, determined species stood its ground and said, "Not here, not now, not while we still breathe." And that was the moment the galaxy began to believe that maybe, just maybe, humanity could do what no one else had ever done: turn the tide. The fall of Arcadia Prime changed everything. It wasn't just another lost world. It became a symbol of courage. Across the galaxy, the story spread faster than any ship could travel. The last words from Arcadia were replayed again and again. We fought for everyone. People who had once felt hopeless began to feel something new stirring inside them. On Earth, the mood had changed. There was grief, yes, but behind that grief was strength. The people were tired of mourning. They wanted action. Engineers worked around the clock. Scientists stopped sleeping. Even farmers and miners volunteered to send materials and resources for the war effort. Humanity had decided that running was never an option. The first meeting after the fall of Arcadia took place in an underground command center deep beneath the Earth's surface. Screens covered the walls, each showing different sectors of space. Every officer in the room knew the odds were terrible. The enemy was stronger, faster, and had technology no one could understand. But one idea connected them all: there had to be a way to fight back. For weeks, humans studied everything they could about the swarm. Pieces of captured machines, burnt fragments from destroyed ships, and data logs collected from battles were all analyzed. At first, the scientists couldn't make sense of it. The enemy seemed too advanced, too alien. Their ships had no pilots, no clear control systems, and moved like living organisms. Then one engineer noticed something strange. The swarm's smaller units always moved in patterns, almost like flocks of birds or schools of fish. There was rhythm and repetition. Maybe they thought it wasn't random at all. The discovery sparked a new hope. If there was a pattern, there had to be a source, a signal controlling the swarm. Humans started testing new ways to detect it. They built scanners from old satellite parts and rewired ancient communication systems. Day by day, the picture became clearer. Somewhere deep within each attack group, there was always a central node controlling the swarm's behavior. That knowledge changed everything. For the first time, the humans had a weakness to target. A plan was made. The next time the enemy attacked, they wouldn't try to destroy everything. They would aim for the control nodes. But to make that possible, they needed new weapons, faster ships, and smarter defenses. Humanity didn't have time to design them from scratch, so they did something bold. They started combining their own technology with the wreckage of the enemy's machines. It was dangerous and unpredictable. Some of the alien materials reacted violently. Others couldn't even be understood. But humans had always been good at one thing: figuring things out no matter how impossible they seemed. Slowly, they began building hybrid weapons, missiles guided by captured swarm processors, ships coated with reactive armor that could adapt mid-battle, and energy beams powered by fusion of human and alien cores. The first prototypes were unstable. They exploded during tests. Some scientists were injured, but nobody stopped. They all knew what was at stake. Every failure was treated as a step forward. When the first working hybrid ship finally launched, it wasn't pretty. It was uneven, patched with parts from a dozen different designs, but it worked. The ship moved faster than anything humanity had before, and when it fired, the weapon tore through an asteroid as if it were paper. The crew watching the test didn't cheer. They just stared quietly, knowing they might have just built something that could change the war. While humans were preparing for the next attack, something unexpected happened. From deep space, faint signals began to appear, messages from alien ships that had once fled. They were small groups at first, captains and crews who couldn't forget what humanity had done at Arcadia. One of the transmissions simply said, "We are coming." Soon, a few small fleets began to arrive near human space. They were damaged and tired, but their presence meant something powerful. Humanity was no longer fighting alone. Together, they started sharing information, weapon blueprints, star maps, and even enemy movement data. The once scattered galaxy was slowly waking up. When the swarm came again, they expected another easy victory. Their ships appeared suddenly, cutting through space like black knives. But this time, the humans were ready. The battle began near a mining station orbiting a dead star. The humans didn't try to face the swarm head-on. Instead, they used their new hybrid ships to strike fast, disappearing into debris fields, reappearing behind enemy formations. Every shot was aimed carefully. Instead of firing at random targets, they searched for the control nodes. When the first node exploded, something incredible happened. Half the enemy fleet froze mid-movement as if confused. The humans had found the key. They focused all their fire on the next node, and again, more of the swarm stopped moving. The battle that should have been another massacre turned into the first real victory. It wasn't easy. Hundreds of ships were still lost and thousands of lives were gone. But when the smoke cleared, the swarm was gone and humans were still standing. The surviving fleet returned to Earth in silence, not celebrating, but proud. They had done something no other species had managed before. They had hurt the enemy. News of the victory spread like wildfire. The images of human ships standing tall against the impossible were broadcast across every channel. For the first time in years, the galaxy saw something other than fear. They saw possibility. Soon, other species began sending envoys to Earth. Leaders who had once called humans reckless now came in person, offering support. Some brought ships, some brought weapons, others simply said, "Teach us what you've learned." Humanity shared everything. They didn't hold anything back. Together, they began building a new coalition, a smaller, stronger alliance based not on politics or power, but on trust and survival. It wasn't called the Celestial Concord anymore. It didn't need a name. It was simply everyone who refused to flee. The cooperation between species wasn't easy. There were disagreements, cultural clashes, and misunderstandings. But humans led by example. They worked side by side with aliens, teaching them how to build hybrid ships and fight as one unit. One day, as a new fleet was preparing for battle, an alien officer asked a human commander, "How do you keep fighting even when everything seems lost?" The commander replied quietly, "Because if we stop, who else will stand?" That answer spread across the coalition. It became their shared belief. Months later, another swarm attack came, larger than before. But this time, the defense lines held. Ships from 5 different species fought together under human command. They moved like one, covering each other, protecting civilians, and targeting enemy nodes with precision. The enemy was forced to retreat. Every victory, no matter how small, built momentum. Humanity kept improving their technology. Learning from every battle, scientists discovered that the swarm's control signals were transmitted through a unique frequency that could be jammed. That discovery allowed the coalition to create new devices capable of disrupting the swarm's coordination temporarily. The next few months were filled with battles, losses, and victories. But for the first time, the galaxy was no longer running. They were standing, and they were following the humans' lead. Even in the darkest moments, humanity's message stayed the same. We don't run, we fight. Back on Earth, people finally started to breathe again. The night skies were filled with streaks of light from ships launching to defend distant worlds. Every citizen knew someone out there, someone fighting under the same belief. Families would stand outside their homes watching the lights fade into the stars, whispering prayers for their safe return. In the command centers, officers began marking systems that had been saved from destruction. Each red mark turned green was a reminder that hope was returning. And on one quiet evening, a message came from a distant world once thought lost. It simply said, "We are alive." We held the line. That short message made everyone in the command room stop and smile. It meant their sacrifices were working. As more victories came, humanity's influence grew stronger. Not because they were the most powerful, but because they had shown what power truly meant, standing firm when everything else falls. In the heart of the galaxy, even the oldest civilizations began to realize that the humans were different. They weren't fighting for control or dominance. They were fighting for everyone's right to exist. And as the coalition gathered strength, one thing became clear. The tide was turning. The swarm was still vast, still dangerous, but for the first time in centuries, the galaxy wasn't afraid anymore. Because when the darkness came again, it no longer found a galaxy divided. It found a wall made of courage led by a small, stubborn species from a blue planet called Earth. And behind that wall stood a promise that humanity would never stop defending the light, no matter how dark the universe became. For months, the galaxy had been preparing. Victories were small but powerful, giving everyone reason to believe the impossible could be done. The swarm that once seemed endless had started to slow down. They still attacked, but now they faced a united defense. For the first time, the enemy wasn't chasing the galaxy was chasing them. But deep inside the void, far beyond known space, the swarm's true core began to stir. It was larger than anything ever seen before, an enormous mass of living metal and dark energy. It absorbed everything in its path, debris, ships, even entire moons. Every signal sent from the core was stronger than the last. Human scientists noticed the readings first. Something big was moving, something massive enough to shake gravity fields across sectors. And its course was clear. It was heading toward the solar system. When the news reached Earth, the silence in the command room was heavy. Every person there knew what it meant. The swarm wasn't just attacking another planet. It was coming for the heart of humanity. Earth was not only home, it was a symbol of hope for the entire coalition. If Earth fell, everything would collapse again. Within hours, the emergency call went out. Across the stars, ships began to move. Fleets from dozens of species turned their course toward Sol. Old enemies stood side by side, united under one command. The humans had inspired something the galaxy hadn't seen for thousands of years. True unity. Every ship that could fly was called to defend. Old vessels were repaired. New ones were built overnight. On Earth, entire cities turned into factories. Even children helped by carrying supplies, sewing uniforms, or helping in communication centers. There was no fear now, just purpose. As the coalition gathered near Earth, the skies above the planet became brighter than ever before. Hundreds of ships floated silently in orbit. Massive carriers, alien cruisers, and human-built destroyers all waited together. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in history. Down below, on the surface of Earth, people watched the stars every night. They could see the faint glow of ships moving above them, tiny sparks of light protecting their home. Farmers, workers, and elders stood outside their homes whispering, "They'll hold the line." Inside the human flagship, officers worked non-stop. The main screen showed the path of the enemy, an endless wave stretching across space. The commander stood quietly, staring at the map, knowing that the coming days would decide everything. If they failed here, there would be no second chance. Scientists on the Moon and Mars continued analyzing the enemy's behavior. They discovered that the new swarm formation had multiple control nodes, each shielded behind layers of energy. Destroying one wouldn't be enough this time. They'd have to take them all out almost at once. It was an impossible task. But humans had faced the impossible before. Every hour felt like a heartbeat. The coalition was ready, but time was running out. Then one night, the first signal came. Long-range sensors picked up the swarm, millions of units moving as one, their black hulls reflecting no light. The darkness was coming. As the swarm entered the outer edge of the solar system, the first human scouts sent their reports. The numbers were overwhelming. The enemy wasn't sending a fleet, it was sending an ocean. But even then, no one stepped back. Orders went out. Hold every line. Defend every planet. The battle began near Neptune. Small human and alien ships faced the first wave. Explosions lit the frozen blue skies. The humans fought fiercely, buying time for the inner defense to prepare. Many ships never returned, but their sacrifice slowed the swarm's approach. Next came the defense of Mars. Thousands of guns installed on the planet's surface fired together. creating a wall of light. Hybrid ships darted between them, targeting enemy control nodes. Every time a node fell, part of the swarm went silent, drifting lifelessly into the void. It was working, but the enemy kept coming. The people on Earth could see flashes in the night sky. They didn't panic. Instead, they prayed, waiting for news. Every time a message came saying Mars still stands, cheers echoed through cities and towns. Everyone felt connected, as if the entire species shared one heartbeat. Back at the human command ship, reports came in faster and faster. Ships were being lost, but the enemy was also bleeding. The humans had learned how to strike where it hurt most. Still, there were too many. The outer defenses couldn't hold much longer. Finally, the commander gave the order. Fall back to Earth's orbit. Prepare for the final stand. The retreat wasn't chaotic. It was coordinated, disciplined, and determined. Every ship that withdrew formed a new line closer to home. By the time they reached Earth, there were only a few hundred ships left. But they stood in formation surrounding the planet like a shield. Then silence. For a few moments, there was no movement. Only the quiet hum of engines and the soft glow of the planet below. Everyone waited for what would come next. When the swarm appeared near the moon, the sight was indescribable. The stars disappeared behind a wall of dark ships. Their movements were fluid, almost alive. For a second, the entire fleet just watched. Then with one command, humanity fired. The sky turned into fire. Missiles, plasma beams, and railgun bursts cut through space. The swarm responded with equal fury. Every explosion painted the black void in white light. Ships were torn apart, but others filled the gaps immediately. No one ran. Every pilot knew this was where they were meant to be. Human and alien ships fought together like a single living being. The coalition's unity showed in every maneuver. Whenever a human ship was surrounded, alien cruisers would shield it. Whenever an alien vessel took heavy fire, human destroyers rushed in to protect it. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about standing together. Meanwhile, deep within the chaos, a small human team was carrying out the most dangerous mission of all. They had located the swarm's main control core, hidden within the thickest part of the fleet. The plan was simple but deadly. They had to reach it and plant a hybrid fusion charge before being destroyed. As the main battle raged, the small team slipped through gaps in the enemy lines. They used stealth technology and debris to hide. One by one, their systems flickered, but they didn't stop. The team's commander sent one final message before going silent. If we fail, keep fighting. On Earth, people gathered in streets, staring at the sky. Every bright flash made them flinch, but no one looked away. They wanted to see their defenders, their families, their hope. Hours passed like days. The coalition fleet was breaking apart. Ships were running low on power. But even then, humanity's voice filled the comm channels. Hold your ground. We're still here. Suddenly, a massive explosion erupted deep inside the swarm's formation. A wave of blue and white light spread outward, brighter than any star. It was the control core. The human team had done it. For a moment, the swarm's movements became chaotic, uncoordinated. Ships collided with one another, crashing into debris. The coalition seized the chance. Every ship fired everything they had left. The swarm began to break apart. The dark wave that once seemed unstoppable was now scattering across the void. The humans had turned the tide once more, but at a terrible cost. Half the fleet was gone. Many who fought would never return home. Yet when the final swarm ship exploded near the moon, the silence that followed was not sad. It was peaceful. Earth was safe. The people on the ground saw the final explosion and cried out in joy. Families hugged. Children pointed at the sky, saying they did it. Across the galaxy, signals poured in from every allied world. The swarm is retreating. The impossible had been done again. In the command room aboard the human flagship, the surviving crew sat in silence, looking at the planet below. The commander's voice finally broke the quiet. They'll come again someday, but we'll be ready, and he was right. Humanity had changed forever. They weren't just survivors anymore, they were defenders. The species that refused to flee had proven that courage could defeat even the darkest enemy. Far away, in the cold emptiness of space, a few swarm fragments still moved slowly, broken and lost. But somewhere inside those shattered remains, a faint signal blinked, a warning that this wasn't the end. Yet for now, Earth was alive. The light of humanity still burned brightly across the stars. And as dawn rose over the blue planet, everyone knew the same truth. When every other species fled, humanity stood. And they defended not just their home, but the very meaning of hope. When the battle ended, silence filled the skies. The swarm was gone. Only drifting metal and broken ships floated above Earth, reflecting the light of a rising sun. It was a strange silence, peaceful yet heavy. The kind that comes after the storm when people finally realize they've survived. The war had left deep scars. Half the coalition fleet was destroyed. Entire planets had gone dark. Yet amid the ruins there was life. The humans and their allies had done what no one thought possible. They had defended their world and saved the galaxy. On Earth, people began stepping out of their shelters for the first time in days. They looked at the sky, where faint trails of burning wreckage still glowed like falling stars. Everyone knew what those lights were, reminders of those who fought and never came back. For a moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, applause began to echo through the streets. Not for victory, but for courage. For the ones who stood when everything seemed lost. Across cities and towns, bells rang. People lit candles in their windows. They didn't celebrate with fireworks, they honored the silence, letting it speak for those who couldn't. In orbit, what was left of the coalition gathered near the moon. Ships of every kind, human, alien, old and damaged, floated together. Their hulls were scorched, their engines barely holding, but they were together. From those ships came messages, thank yous, promises, and quiet tears. The war was over. The first task was to find survivors. Rescue teams searched wreckage fields for days, pulling people from escape pods and damaged ships. Every life saved felt like a miracle. Whenever a rescue signal was found, the entire command center on Earth would cheer. Those moments reminded everyone why they had fought so hard. After the last survivors were brought home, the rebuilding began. The damage was massive. Space stations had been torn apart. Cities on Mars were in ruins and thousands of families were missing someone. Yet humans didn't break down. They got to work. On Earth, factories shifted from making weapons to building homes. Scientists who once studied how to destroy began studying how to heal. They used what they had learned from the swarm, its energy systems, its materials, to create new technologies that helped repair instead of harm. The same hybrid science that built warships was now being used to power cities, purify oceans, and rebuild planets. In a strange way, humanity had turned the very thing that tried to destroy them into a force for good. The galaxy watched in awe. Many species couldn't understand how humans could move on so fast, how they could lose so much and still smile, still help others before themselves. But that was what made them different. They didn't see survival as enough. They wanted to make sure no one else ever faced what they did. Soon, ships bearing the symbol of Earth began traveling across the stars again, not as soldiers, but as builders. They helped other worlds rebuild their homes, repair their skies, and restore their hope. Wherever those ships arrived, people said the same words. The humans came. They weren't seen as dangerous anymore. They weren't the reckless newcomers or the loud warriors. They had become something more, the defenders of light, the ones who stayed. Years passed and the galaxy changed. The coalition that fought under human command didn't dissolve after the war. Instead, it grew stronger. A new council was formed not based on fear or power, but on shared respect. And in its heart was Earth. Not ruling, but guiding. Every year, the members of the coalition gathered to remember the war, not as a day of mourning, but as a day of unity. They called it the Day of Standing. On that day, every planet stopped fighting. Every fleet went silent, and every person looked up to the stars to honor those who had stood for them. On Earth, a monument was built not of gold or stone, but of the metal collected from the wrecks of ships that fell in battle. It stood in the middle of a quiet valley, surrounded by trees and rivers. The metal still carried scars and burn marks, but that made it beautiful. At its base, simple words were carved. They stood when others fled. People from all over the galaxy came to visit. Some left flowers, others just sat quietly, feeling the wind and remembering. There was no gate, no guards, because it wasn't a place of power. It was a place of memory. Over time, humans became known not for their weapons, but for their spirit. They taught others how to fight not just with strength, but with belief. They shared stories, not of war, but of courage, kindness, and connection. Many young species started modeling their fleets and defense systems after the humans' example, not because of their technology, but because of their unity. When someone asked why humans were so determined, the answer was always simple. Because when the darkness comes, someone has to hold the light. In the years that followed, explorers began traveling farther than anyone before. They found new systems, new life, and even remnants of the swarm, silent, dead machines floating in endless black. Scientists studied them carefully, but no one feared them anymore. Humanity had learned that fear only grows if you run from it. Instead, they turned those remnants into reminders, symbols of what happens when people give up hope. In museums and academies, young students would look at pieces of old swarm ships and listen to the stories of how their ancestors fought for the future they now lived in. Even among aliens, human stories became part of culture. Children on distant planets grew up hearing tales of the humans who stood on burning worlds and refused to leave. They learned that courage isn't about winning, it's about not surrendering no matter how dark it gets. Back on Earth, life slowly returned to peace. Cities were rebuilt, forests grew again, and oceans cleared. The night skies, once filled with warships, now carried explorers and cargo vessels. People walked under those skies with quiet pride, knowing that the light above them was protected by generations who refused to bow to fear. Yet, somewhere deep inside, every human still carried the memory of that war. It wasn't bitterness, it was respect. They knew that peace wasn't permanent, that someday another darkness might rise. But they also knew something even more powerful, that when it did, humanity would stand again. The children of that new age grew up strong and curious. They studied the stars not as enemies to fight, but as friends to explore. But even as they learned science and technology, their teachers always reminded them of the past, of the time when every other species fled and humanity stayed. One evening, many years later, a small group of students visited the great monument. The sun was setting, painting the metal in shades of gold and red. One of the children looked up and asked, why did they fight even when they knew they might die? An old veteran sitting nearby smiled softly. Because, he said, they weren't fighting for themselves. They were fighting for all of us, for the chance for you to be here asking that question. The child looked at the monument again, quiet for a moment, and whispered, then they didn't really die, did they? The old veteran shook his head. No, people like that never truly die. They live on, in every heart that refuses to give up. As night fell, the stars began to shine one by one. They looked peaceful, calm, like tiny fires keeping the universe warm. Among them, the faint glow of distant ships could be seen, traveling farther into the unknown. Humanity was still moving forward, still exploring, still protecting. The war had taken much, but it had given something greater in return. It had shown the galaxy what it meant to be human. Not perfect, not fearless, but unbreakable. And so even as centuries passed, one story continued to echo across the stars. A story told around campfires, in schools, and on distant colonies. The story of how, when the universe trembled and every other species fled into the dark, humanity stood tall, looked at the endless night, and chose to defend it. Because that is who they were. That is who they will always be. And somewhere, written among the stars themselves, remained the quiet truth that shaped an entire galaxy. When every other species fled, humanity stood and defended.